For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Brindavani Naidu. With me is award-winning eyewitness news reporter Mandy Wiener to discuss her first book, Killing Kebble and Underworld Exposed. Hi Mandy. This book has been described as cutting open the belly of the beast of Johannesburg's criminal underworld. How on target is this description?
I think to an extent it is quite on target because it does give that unique insight into what's going on in our underworld that people perhaps weren't privy to before. And it really does give that first-hand account, quite literally, from Mikey Schultz and Nigel McGurk and Kappie Smith about how that underworld operates. And it delves into that psyche of the hitman and exactly what is going on. So I think hopefully to an extent it is quite accurate.
There's this intricacy or relationship between business, politics and organized crime in South Africa that is brought to the fore in this novel. And at the time of the launch of this book, Czech millionaire Radovan Krejcir and head of crime intelligence Richard Mdluli are dominating the news headlines. What do you make of this, and how much so do you feel that this is a threat to democracy?
Well, I think certainly this particular crime, the Brett Kebble murder, is the nexus, and it shows the overlap between business, organised crime and politics in South Africa, and the extent to which law enforcement is so vulnerable to corruption in South Africa. And it's like we're watching the same movie again. It's the same story repeating itself. It's simply a continuation of what happened in the book, the story about Radovan Krejcir and Richard Mdluli, and we're seeing exactly the same cycle repeating itself. So you have almost Radovan Krejcir replacing Brett Kebble as the so-called Don, and the same underworld figures going to him for money and for backing, and then you've got a police commissioner who seems to have been influenced, and a hitman and a hit list. So it really does seem to be the same situation repeating itself, and it does seem as though business is still as vulnerable as it was before.
To what extent do you think this novel exposes the constant challenge of South Africa's police force being exposed to bribery and corruption when we look at this through the experience that you've had with Jackie Selebi? And also, can you take us through this relationship between the Scorpions and the police force that unfolds in your book?
For me, the book is about so much more than just the hitmen and their story. It's about that relationship, that acrimonious relationship between the police and the Scorpions, and how effectively the Brett Kebble murder case was a victim of that relationship. Because you had the Scorpions fighting for survival, and what better for them than to go after the National Police Commissioner to prove that they should be independent and they should continue to exist. And then you've got the police service trying to protect their commissioner, and this tenuous relationship between both sides. And I think that really comes across. And we're seeing that to the same extent again as well with the Hawks and crime intelligence, and that same kind of relationship developing in the police again. And I think that the book really does show that. It shows how there was no political will to prosecute Glenn Agliotti, and how ultimately the Kebbles never saw justice because no one really took this case seriously.
What is your view of Nigel, Mikey and Kappie receiving indemnity in this case? And I mean, what did this signify to you through your reporting of the country's justice system? And do you feel that there was fair representation of lawyers on both sides of this case?
Well, I think it's a remarkable set of circumstances. The fact that you have the killers admitting guilt and being given indemnity. So effectively they've gotten away with murder, and they're allowed to walk free. And they acknowledge in the book, they say that it's like winning the lottery for them, that they can't believe the fact that where in the world do you get a deal like that? You admit to killing a high-profile, prolific businessman with incredible political connections, and you get to walk free. And I was fortunate in that I was granted an interview with Vusi Piccoli, and that's in the book as well, the fact that he does regret to some extent the way that it all turned out, and the fact that everyone ultimately walked free. And that's the real concern, the fact that they weren't given plea bargain agreements. And I always compare it to the Shri and Dewani case, the fact that in that matter they were given plea bargain agreements. But in this matter, everybody got to evade jail time.
Okay. Now, from one journalist to the next, I have to ask, why this book and how important do you believe this is?
Well, I think books are incredibly important. And I think it's important that more journalists write books in this country, because I think for posterity it's important, because if anything, what I want people to take away from it is the fact that our democracy was so deeply threatened, and the same story is repeating itself. So if anybody takes anything away, it's that being able to caution against our democracy being threatened and our state agencies being abused in the way that they were. Because I think we get a unique insight into the corridors of power and how police officers were scrambling to protect one another, how prosecutorial independence was meddled with, and if anything, I want people to caution against that happening again.
Also, how do you maintain your journalistic integrity while you create these relationships with Glenn Agliotti and the so-called Kebble hitman through your interviews? And how do you keep objective when you're listening to Mikey, Nigel and Cuppy, juxtaposed with your interviews with Roger and Guy Kebble?
The way that I look at the book is it's a collection of versions, and I'm not passing judgment. I'm seeing myself as a storyteller and a conduit for their stories. So I'm simply giving them a platform to each tell their own version of what happened. So at no point do I say, I sympathize with Mikey and I believe his version, because I don't do that. Ultimately, I leave it up to the reader to decide whether or not they believe that Brett Kebble was complicit in his own murder, that he was an active participant, or whether Roger and Guy Kebble are correct when they say that he simply didn't have the character to have himself killed. So I'm very conscious of keeping that distance. Of course, I had to build relationships with the characters, and I had to cultivate relationships with them in order to gain their loyalty and their trust, or else we never would have had the book. But they know where I stand, and I've been very transparent with them, and I said to them, it'll be honest and it'll be accurate, and they're not going to like everything that they read. And that's the response I've had from them. They've all read it, and they don't like everything, but they believe that, like a 204, it's honest and it's transparent.
What was the most difficult and exciting for you in writing this novel?
Well, I think writing a book is very different to being an eyewitness news radio reporter, because on radio I tell my story in 40 seconds and I don't get to put in the nuance and the detail and the analysis, and I have to do that in the book. I have to give opinion and I have to give analysis, and I have to write long and give so much more detail, which I don't get to do on radio. So that for me has been the most challenging yet the most fulfilling, because I get to tell people that all that interesting detail about what goes on behind the scenes and the relationships between people and the nuance. And I think that's definitely been the most fun.
Thank you.
Donate now and give 15 Rand a month. SMS JOIN to 41486.